Cultural country. We have a lot of things happening over the last 5,000, 10,000 years, but there has been a systematic distortion, systematic ignorance being bred into our affairs. And as a part of as a small part of our interest, we try to bring in some of these discussions, book launches and other events which try to ignite the minds of people from all ages and all backgrounds, so that we go back and try to learn more about our dharma, our culture, our own history. That's a basic specification of Jijnasa. We've been doing these programs for a lot of time. Our details are there on the Facebook, on our blogspot, a lot of places. And we will also, at the end of the session, provide a sheet where you can provide your email ID so that you can keep in touch with us. We also are partnering with India Facts, which is a wonderful platform to take out the distortion and challenge the mainstream media in terms of any controversial issues. They take on some of the most controversial things that are affecting dharma, that are attacking dharma, and they write very bold articles and publish. So indiafacts.org. We have Dharma Foundation, which is really helping us in the same way. They're also trying to strive towards dharma. So with the broad spectrum of Jijnasa, CESS, India Facts, Dharma Foundation, for all these, we are conducting this particular event. And the event is a very, very specific one and a very exciting one. And this event, before I read about the event and before I read about all the details of the great author, I would like to welcome today's chief guest as well as our author, Mr. Vamsee Krishna. Please come on the stage, sir. And along with it, I welcome Mr. Amit Malviya, who is coordinating the Jijnasa thing. So please welcome them with a big round of applause. Mr. Vamsee Krishna Juluri is a professor of media studies in the University of San Francisco. He's got a very long and very interesting profile. I'm going to just keep it very short and give you what is specific here. He's a novelist, he's an author, he's a public intellectual whose writings have been published in various platforms like the Swarajya, Foreign Affairs, Huffington Post, Hinduism Today, Indian Express, the Hindu, the paper which has the name Hindu, the India Currents, the First Post, a lot of things. And what is this book? The book is Rearming Hinduism. It's a very provoking, at the same time it's having a lot of meaning. Rearming Hinduism. What exactly we're going to rearm? We're going to hear from the author in a short while. This is basically a devastating and an astute critique of Hinduphobia. We all have heard about Hinduphobia, and so many times we shake our head and say, these are the kind of things that we are doing. Oh, the Aryan invasion. Oh, people used to do blood sacrifice. Oh, people did this, people did that. So these are the kind of things, and he picks up those very controversial things which have been kind of put as references nowadays in so many places in academia, and he challenges them. He challenges them, and he's challenging them with the nature, with the history, with the prehistory, and all the aspects of Hinduphobia. He's covering everything, and he's rearming us, the people who have pride in Hinduism, who are not against anybody, but we have pride in our own culture. So he's rearming us with a lot of details on how the predatory and self-destructive culture that has been bred in over here, and how do we really oppose it effectively? Because we can't just go and burn some effigy and then feel good about it. We have to be factual, we have to do it in a very scholarly way. And that's the kind of book that he has written. It's a fantastic book, and it's a reference for people who want to do this kind of take on the challenges to Sanatana Dharma. So with this very brief introduction, I would like to call upon my colleague Mr. Amit Malviya to come for a minute and give a brief about the book which Dr. Shatavadhani Ganesh was supposed to give, but he could not make it, and I would like to invite upon Amit to do that. Okay. So we also want to do the felicitation before that. That's a fantastic opportunity. I would like to introduce the Heritage Foundation. And this foundation is headed by Srimati Vijayalakshmi, who is with us here. And it's a non-profit. It's working to preserve and disseminate the awareness of our nature and our culture. And they do some very interesting things in Bangalore, like Gudiya Sambrama, the celebration around the temples. You know, they're bringing back the culture that was there with us and why temples were the center of attraction. Srishti Sambhrama. There's so much that Srimati Vijayalakshmi does, and I would like to invite her to felicitate Dr. Juluri first. It's my privilege to call upon Madam. Madam, please. And now, the release of the book, you know, the fantastic rearming part, and we all need to arm ourselves. So, Juluri, Vijayalakshmi, Mr. Malviya. Thank you very much. And now over to Mr. Malviya. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming here in such large numbers. As Kiran said, I coordinate this platform along with my friends. We've been doing this for some time. I stand here today in place of Dr. Shatavadhani Ganesh. And when I say that, I mean I will be only reading what he had to say, and in no other terms. He is unfortunately not being able to join us because of a personal emergency at his place, and he profusely apologized for not being able to make it. But when I spoke to him this morning, he was very, very happy to see the book. He had some very charitable things to say about the book. So I requested that he provide his comments on the book, which I could read to the audience here, and that would give you a sense of how he perceived the book. He said, and I sort of read that for you, the main hallmark of the book is developing sensitivity towards Hinduism, unlike some Western counterparts and even some of our Indian cousins, whose reactions are mainly arising from the head and lack the sensitivity that the author has contained. This is the right approach to study or reveal any culture, and especially so in the case of Hinduism. More than the flamboyant reaction to the events of present and past brought out with or without sufficient facts, that the general tendency of any author is, the present book traces a new thought, looking at the situation from a higher perspective, so that the problems or shortcomings will be no more so. This is exactly what our spiritual Maharshis like Ramakrishna Paramahansa and Ramanan Maharshi did. By doing so, not only the precious time and energy are saved, but also any criticism can be rightly placed so that its due place and strategies to counter or methods to adopt are naturally realized. The spiritual sensitivity with respect to nature and culture will be honed from the perspective of ecology. This aspect has been effectively brought out by the author. This has a lasting impact on any serious endeavor that brings the seed of the Sanatana Dharma closer to us. The diction and style, approach and scheme of this book is very close to Indian ethos, which can be retrieved from the masterly texts like Upanishads, Jataka tales, epic fragments, and folklore. And this has a very friendly bearing on any common reader who comes across this book. At no place the work is pedantic and structurally baffling. And unfortunately, this is what we find in many of the recent works on Sanatana Dharma. He has some suggestions for you, Professor, and I sort of read them out. He says, I would expect the author to shed some more light on more seminal aspects of Sanatana Dharma, like the yagna, dana, and tapas, the three-folded practice of Sanatana Dharma on both the secular and religious front. Added to this, as Dr. V. Raghavan says, the greatest three values that Sanatana Dharma has contributed to the world heritage in the form of Brahma, which is absolute truth, Dharma, the absolute good, and rasa, the absolute beauty, should be incorporated so that the well-known modules like the Purusharthas, Ruta and Runa are well taken care of. These were Dr. Shatavadhani Ganesh's comments. It would obviously have been a privilege if he was here, but as things stand, he could not. On that note, I will welcome Professor Vamsee to take over the stage and talk about the book, and we'll then proceed on. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you to Jijnasa and all the wonderful organizations and members of the community here. I'm very grateful to be back in Bangalore after many, many years. I remembered as we were coming in, I remember being in this building about 25 or 30 years ago for a quiz competition. Now I don't remember whether we won or lost, but it doesn't matter. Keep fighting. I'd like to begin by reading from the preface of the book and then just say a few things about my intellectual training background, particularly because I've come to this from the point of view not of theology or any expertise in the scriptures or in Sanskrit and our vast heritage, but I've come to it from an unlikely position, which is media studies. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and then we can look forward to the conversation with all of us. This is from the preface, and it's entitled Your Hinduism. You are an achievement. You may not know fully why just yet, but you have probably felt in some quiet way the fact that you belong to something significant that has come before you in history. You might not always know how to express that feeling, but you know that it inspires you and it elevates you. You belong to the one civilization that still stands much as it once did, even after all these thousands of years of human history. Thousands of years of wars, conquest, pillage, subjugation, desecration and devastation. Thousands of years of supposed progress that have given us a world today that runs on brutal violence against nature, life, and the planet itself. You belong to a civilization that is still standing, but surrounded, as it were, by a mess in India and across the whole world of environmental devastation, cultural confusion, ethical indifference, and economic insecurity. But still, it stands, still there is hope. For a civilization is not just buildings and machines, but its people, their thought, and their culture. It is a way of knowing the world, a way of giving meaning and value to the contents of life. It is a resource, most of all, for living intelligently. It is a form of culture, an expression of sensibility, a way of harmonizing science, philosophy, and ethics in a people's every thought, word, and deed. You can call it a religion, or a way of life, or a civilization. You can call it what you will, but no word will suffice. A billion people on this earth still call God by the same names that people did thousands of years ago. What exists on this earth unchanged for that long? What religion exists on this earth for that long, when so many people have distorted religion and dragged it down from being about love and freedom to being about hatred, coercion, and war? Hinduism could have been wiped out a long time ago, but it wasn't. You are here. So, I obviously believe that we are living through a historical moment, a moment of civilizational awakening, and I have broken with the established intellectual consensus on that issue. I do not think what is happening with the Indian people right now, with people here and in the diaspora, I do not think it can be reduced to the simplistic and often hypocritical debates about secularism and communalism. I think what we are seeing, witnessing for several years now is a slow and sometimes rough but inevitable return to nature, because that's what we have been doing historically for thousands of years. We've been living with nature in a way that modern civilization simply doesn't know how. It's starting to flounder around and ask the questions and talk about global warming and pollution and all these things now, and animal rights and all these things right now. But we were doing it long before they even knew what history was. And I think all of us today are part of a movement which is now trying to say, this is what we need to express, embody, and live once again. So the challenge, of course, we're all familiar with this. Increasingly, we are moving into an environment, a cultural, intellectual, ideological environment, where the simple common sense truth that many of us have held dear in our hearts is not reflected in the culture, it is not reflected in our curriculum, in our textbooks, and by many of our so-called intellectuals. And that is a real challenge. Because what has happened is, for a very long time, we've gone through our lives, we've gone on with our lives, being Hindu in a very, very personal, emotional way. And not arguing with anybody about it. We've gone to temples, we've prayed, we've had our gods dear in our heart. But we have not really made the effort, I think, until now, to rediscover what our thought is about, what our culture is about, and more importantly, how relevant and indeed essential it is to the survival, not only of Hinduism and India, but really the whole planet. And I consider the planet to be not just all the people in it, but all the living beings in it. At least that's what my civilization has taught me, that we need to be thinking about all the living beings in this world. So the way I look at it, and if you find this argument interesting, actually please do check out my article on foreign affairs recently. I think there's a very simple way of understanding what is happening right now in India and in the minds and hearts of Hindus in historical and generational terms. If you look at the traditional debates, say the debates we hear in what our friend described as a newspaper called The Hindu, or in the regular intellectual circles, the narrative there very simply says, the idea of India was raised on the Red Fort, August 15, 1947, on the ideals of secularism and so on and so forth. And then it suddenly started to collapse ever since Hindus started asking questions. So I'm simplifying, but that is sort of the dominant narrative that we have in the academia in the West, and academia and intellectual circles in India also. Now, their view essentially probably is that this noble ideal of secularism, which was created with great effort in the last century or so, is being undone by all of us who write and read books called Rearming Hinduism, perhaps. But anyway, that is one way of looking at it, and obviously I believe, and I don't think all of us believe, that it's highly, highly flawed. That what we're witnessing is not a breakdown of so-called secular consensus and the emergence of communalism and fascism or fundamentalism, whatever they want to call it. We don't know these words, they're alien to us. But really, the re-emergence of Hindu civilizational existence, thought, reflection. And it is happening in a bumpy way, no doubt, because the conditions that we're facing are enormously stacked against us, economically, culturally, politically, and globally. We are no longer in a national context isolated from the world. Everything we do has to be done globally. In fact, that's one of the issues that I hope we'll talk about later. We have to elevate the present moment of Hindu struggle, I think, from a national sense to a more global sense as well. I'm not saying we have to go everywhere and do everything, but you just have to understand that there are global forces we are being challenged by, not just domestic ones. So what I said in my foreign affairs piece essentially is that we can understand what is going on in Hinduism today in terms of just 3 generations. If you look at the people living in India today, right, I mean, they're essentially from 3 generations. There is the oldest generation, people from my parents' generation, people in their 70s or 80s, they're India's oldest living generation. And on that note, actually, I should just mention the book is dedicated to my father, Professor J.V. Ramana Rao. He passed away a few months ago before he could see it, but I'm sure this is a book he would be very proud of. And yeah, he was extremely proud of my having chosen this as the cover. I have a very, very special affection for Hampi. My mother was born there, and I visited there with my students once, and this image of Lord Narasimha has been with me ever since. And when I started writing this book, which I incidentally wrote in about 3 weeks last April, the spirit of righteous fury or hope, I don't know what it was, I've never written a book this fast. Actually, this was the image that inspired the book in many ways, because it seemed to me like Lord Narasimha was sitting down to write and his hand is broken, or his hand is missing. So that's the reason I called it Rearming Hinduism. You know, we just need our hand back to tell our story. So my parents' generation, I guess our generation, those of us, you know, maybe in their 40s and 50s, the parents' generation, and then the children, you know, people born after liberalization. So in a way, everything that we say is Hinduism today is really about what these 3 generations are going to do, so that the next 3 generations and so on and so forth are going to deal with it. Okay. Our parents' generation, my parents' generation, we often forget this, grew up at a time when India was a British colony. You know, parents of my parents' generation, and even my grandparents who passed away several years ago, they had stories about how fearful they were when they were young people or children. If they were on a train and there were British officers on a train, they would try to escape and go into another compartment. Of course, there were some brave people too. So essentially, we are not very far away from having survived colonialism, which is what many leftist intellectuals are all the time, you know, saying let's fight colonialism, seem to forget. They seem to forget that Hinduism is a colonial survivor religion. Okay, they've just gone into believing they're an oppressor religion, but anyway, I'll talk about that later. So we are looking at a Hinduism that was given to us by people who were living Hinduism in a manner that was suited to surviving the pressures and the terrors of colonialism. Now remember, Hinduism is probably the only religion that really survived colonial and imperial forces. Okay? And the way it did, and there's some very important studies done on this by some scholars who've been a little more respectful and understanding of, I think, our worldview. One argument essentially is that we survived colonialism by withdrawing into silence. So during the time of British colonialism, we kind of turned Hinduism, I mean, it had already turned, by the way, because we've been facing pressures for at least 1,000 years, as we know, into something private. You know, we go to temples, we pray, but we don't really express or assert our social philosophies in terms of, you know, what is going on in the world. You know, we just got private, we got silent, we survived by non-defining ourselves. You know, a kind of intellectual, cultural, civilizational form of what we do when we are driving in Hyderabad, or I guess in Bangalore or anywhere, which is just adjust. Because if we didn't just adjust, we would all be stressed out and very, very upset, right? So, in a way, that's what we did as a civilization when the British were ruling us. We survived. We said, you want to come and do some Indological studies and write nonsense about us? It's okay, do it. You know, and then we went, times changed, you know, we got our freedom, some of us went to America and so on. There also people were saying funny things about us. Again, we said, it's okay, you do what you want, doesn't matter, we'll build our temples, our gods will protect us. So that's kind of the old survival strategy we've been coming along with. Now, things have changed. That generation is almost gone. They have given their best visions, you know, whatever they can to us. And now my generation, you know, essentially the parents who are making these decisions for the next generation about exactly what is significant about Hinduism. What is it about Hinduism that we want to retain, rediscover, revive, restore, elevate, and what is it that we want to kind of say maybe in some other time and place it was relevant, maybe for the modern age it's not that relevant. Okay. So these are the kind of choices we are facing as parents today, and many of us are also facing it in a global context, right? There's a huge Indian diaspora. We are trying to figure out how to raise our children in other countries, and of course, I don't think raising children in India is what it was before either, right? I mean, India in many ways is a little America. Global culture, satellite TV, the internet, mall culture, everything. So the whole world is, inundated with this global culture, and even in India, as parents, those of us who are in the 40s and 50s are facing these choices. What is it about Hinduism that we transmit to the next generation? Especially because the next generation is very information savvy. They ask questions. They're very liberal in some ways, and they've already been deeply brainwashed, I think, in some ways by the deeply Hinduphobic intellectual establishment in schools and so on. So the problem is there are two legacies. There's the old colonial legacy of being silent, which we have to get over. Then there's the Nehruvian era legacy of secularism and accepting all sorts of nonsense. That legacy too we need to somehow get over. And I think for my generation, the Nehruvian legacy was very, very powerful. And because, when I was studying in the 80s, that's basically what we learned in our history textbooks was that, India was originally in the Indus Valley, and then the Aryans invaded, brought this sacrificial, barbaric religion. Then the Mughals tried to civilize us, and the British tried to civilize us, and, so on and so forth. Now the thing was, in my generation, for various reasons, maybe largely economic, largely because our parents were so worried that given, I think, our deep mystical spiritual nature, we would go into spiritualism and not earn money and support the family. Many of us were discouraged from taking Hinduism seriously, right? I mean, our parents used to say, yeah, you go and pray, but otherwise you pray for good marks, you pray for job, green card, visa, whatever. We were not encouraged to. I was not encouraged. I used to buy books anyway, but somehow, it was always considered weird. Why are you buying all these books on Hinduism or reading them? Philosophy is something that only people who don't get into engineering or drop out of engineering do. So, okay, so I guess that's me a little bit. So, anyway, so that is the dilemma now. We have this three-generational experience of Hinduism that confronts us, and now what do we do with it? That is the historical perspective. The secular communal thing is a blip. It's insignificant. I think that debate is highly insignificant. I mean, we are looking at if not a cosmic, at least an epochal civilizational time scale. People been around for thousands of years, living fairly intelligently, making mistakes along the way maybe, but for the most part, surviving in a as less harmful way as we can. Now, the second challenge, more specifically about the intellectual challenge, and I'll just say that, read a page and turn over the floor. I'm just curious, how many of you have actually read the big fat Wendy Doniger book or tried to read it? Can you raise your hands? Okay, thank you. I applaud your courage and determination. I want to explain a little bit about where this argument is coming from, where academia is today. Okay. So, now the social sciences typically are very young. They're hardly 100 years old, right? I mean, the universities in America really began to establish these schools of social sciences really only in the early 1900s. Now, media research, and of course those days it was called mass communication research, really took off in earnest around the 1920s. And mass communication research is a huge field. It was funded by the US military and various corporations. And their goal was to figure out how to use the media of the time, like newspapers, radio, like a cinema, to deploy in wartime propaganda and counter-propaganda. So, all the studies that were done from the 1920s to about the 50s or so largely looked at how to use the media to manipulate people's minds and use it like a tool. Then by the 50s that started to change, other schools of thought emerged and so on. And then in the 60s, a big change took place in academia broadly and in the media field too. And it was a rise of what today we broadly call, the Marxist, leftist approach to the study of society and the humanities. And in its original formulation in the 60s and 70s in academia, it carried a lot of promise, and I'll tell you why. And of course, even though it carried a lot of promise, it failed us badly. And I'll tell you why about that in a second too. Now, till about the 60s, the social sciences, the humanities, history, world history was narrated from a very simple, dominant, Eurocentric point of view. Right? We know that. So, for example, textbooks in America till about the 60s or 70s, school textbooks would say that Columbus discovered America. Right? And they would probably say that the people living there were savages or primitive people, things like that. Now, what happened in the 60s and 70s essentially is that there was a great uproar and upheaval in academia, in the universities. Young people started asking questions. There was civil rights, the free speech movement, the women's movement, all these things happened. So the old paradigms in academia got overturned. So by the 1970s, a lot of new voices emerged. Now these were voices which were previously silenced or marginalized or oppressed in the mainstream Western academy, right? So you had the rise of women's studies department, black studies, ethnic studies, gay studies, all these things, which was, really broadened the discourse, because until then you were hearing one narrow point of view of, I guess, the Eurocentric point of view. So that broadened the debate. There were all sorts of questions being asked. In my field in particular, there was a new school of thought which emerged, broadly called cultural studies, which came out of England. Very, very important work, very interesting work, because they stopped asking questions like, how do we use television to make people switch from one cornflakes brand to another? They said, how is television shaping meaning? How are people creating meanings about themselves, the world they live in? So very exciting work was being done. Unfortunately, what happened in that time period, say from the 70s to the present, academia got caught up in the downside of this kind of new multiculturalism and counter-Eurocentrism, call it what you will. It got caught up in a very, very institutionalized calculus of identity politics. Okay? So initially it was good that, a lot of people were saying, hey, okay, you said Columbus discovered America? No, you're wrong. I mean, here's the Native American Studies Center at my university, and it's telling us so many histories of Native Americans, their point of view. So all this stuff was happening, but then slowly the identity politics became deeply entrenched, and of course they have watered down, seeped down all the way from America to many of our Indian universities as well. And what has happened in this new calculus of identity politics is that suddenly it was not your use of reason, it was not your use of examples, evidence, it was only the identity that you invoked that got you branded as right or wrong in academia. And in this bizarre circus or travesty of intellectual pursuit, guess who got reclassified as the bad guys? The Hindus. So it is an amazing, amazing act of intellectual omission, skullduggery, subterfuge, call it what you will. I mean, here we are, essentially battered, somehow surviving, but battered for 1,000 years, battered even by the officially recognized form of imperialism, which is European colonialism for 500 years. We are barely 50 years out of it, and then suddenly, academia now says that, Hindu, not just saying I'm Hindu, not even a Hindu supremacist argument, whatever that is, I hardly see it. We are often accused of it. Just being Hindu, just saying I'm Hindu, is perceived today in many academic circles as saying, I am superior to all of you, I am of a superior caste, I believe that men are superior to women. There is so much ugly baggage that academia has put on this word, which is not consistent with the reality of our philosophy, our gurus, our saints, our paramparas, And our gods, the way we understand our gods, whether it is through Amar Chitrakada and or classical Rajkumar and NTR movies, or the actual Puranas, we understand our gods as in a way that this simple, simplistic identity politics can't even grasp. So what has happened in academia now is virtually any research that's being done on media, on culture, anything, simply kind of goes in to say, oh, this is happening, Ramayana is there, okay, somebody's praying to Rama, there, that means they want to drive out all the Muslims from India. I mean, how simple is, who cares? I mean, our relationship to the divine is so profound, it's so rich, it's so sophisticated. I mean, we are one of the few civilizations who can't be bothered to fight people about what name they give to God, right? We don't have names for non-believers. I mean, that's kind of who we are. And here we are now facing all this unnecessary junk coming out from academia and the media. So anyway, I just want to quickly explain how Doniger's book fits into this context, because I know many people were offended by it and by its very inaccurate and erotic interpretations and all. That's not the chief problem. I'll tell you what the chief problem, its own premise and why its own premise fails. I've explained it in the book first half. So remember this example I gave of the Native Americans and how we used to be taught that Columbus discovered America, right? Now, till the 70s there was a dominant history. Then the 70s onwards, a lot of new histories were written in America, like Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, popular books like Lies My Teachers Told Me, etc. So these were alternative histories. So they were challenging the old Eurocentric history and saying, no, this is the women's history, this is Native American history, African American history, etc. Now, Wendy Doniger's book, The Hindus and Alternative History, obviously presumes to be doing something like that. And if you look at the structure of the book, what does Wendy Doniger's book say? Indian history begins with the Indus Valley civilization, which is not Hindu. Then come the Aryans invading India, who bring Hinduism, so to speak. And for good measure, he compares the Aryan invasion to the Nazis' conquest of Europe during World War II and the European genocide of North America. How bizarre is that? Very few people picked up on this. I mean, we are often criticized for saying we don't like a book, that the Hindu right asks for bans on books without reading them. But you know what? There's a lot of secular supporters of books who also cheer on books without reading them, it appears. It was very apparent to me when I read that big fat book. Anyway, so the premise of Doniger's book is flawed, and then I think there's many questions to ask about how we can narrate a better and more useful history today, and many of us are working in many different directions. And one more point I just want to add about why this is important. For a very long time, taking it easy, as I said, was an old colonial response to British colonialism. We are living in a different era today. We're living in an era where many children are exposed, spend more time physically with the media, with television, with gadgets and iPhones and their content than with grandparents or extended family. It's a fact. Urbanization, anonymization are part of how history has been unfolding for the last couple of 100 years. So for the present, it is very important that we take academia seriously, that we take media discourses about us seriously. It's not enough for us to say, let them say what they want, or we'll be in our own world and so on. No, we have to engage and fight the politics of definition. We have to engage with academia, tell them where they're wrong, and make them change. So that is one of the conversations I hope this book will start. I just wanted to read one more page, a couple of minutes. It's from the second, but having said many things about the political and historical things, I wanted to say just one thing about the spiritual part, which is what I do in the second part of the book. I guess it's my Hindu tendencies, I can't leave it with only the political part. I have to say something about what's in my heart.
Yes.
So the first part of the book, by the way, is called Desakala Dosha. I don't know if there's a puja for that. I think my book was my puja, which is academia, desakala dosha. Second part is Sanatana, just my impression of what I think is relevant and beautiful about Hindu thought. This is from a chapter called Cousins and Friends. There's Krishna, Rama, or gods, popular gods. Hinduism is rooted in one glorious instruction, which is to see all as one, Tvameva. It is an instruction ideally pursued in certain idyllic environmental conditions. In the forest, perhaps, in the deer park, perhaps, in the morning sun-baked face of a Himalayan peak, perhaps, the sense of you alone, Tvameva, is clear. There the salt and water dissolve peacefully, like in the Upanishadic example. There you are alone, a sage withdrawn from world and worldly mind. There you can be one and become one. But what of the rest of us? What of all of us living not in forests, not in serene Himalayan lake hermitages, but in this world of noise, anger, competition, desires, demands, most of all people who will not be what we hope they will be. We are put here in a social world, in a family, in a job, in a school, a community. We are not just spirits in search of truth, but we are sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, cousins and friends, colleagues, co-workers, teachers, students, races and nations. We are in this world. We are here as sons and daughters, mothers, fathers, brothers, cousins, friends. Krishna, Yashoda, Rama and Kaushalya, Sumitra and even Kaikeyi, Parvati and Ganesha, Krishna and Arjuna, Rama and Hanuman. Between them unfolds the universe. Between them unfolds all the love in the universe. Ideally, we remember Tvameva Mata Pita Bandhusaka. But we humans, we carry more than the moment with us. We carry history. We carry thought. We carry, to use a contemporary word, baggage. Sometimes in between two humans, a boy and a girl in love perhaps, or a mother and a baby in play, or an elder and a grandchild, what lies between them blooms full and true into the moment. It is love, it is truth, it is the sustenance of the cosmos. Baggage is forgotten. But more often than not, in the daily grind of our lives, what lies between humans is not love. It is perhaps only habit, social role, an itch or expectation, and sometimes a prison. Sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, brothers, cousins, friends. Between them sometimes also burns all the folly of hate in the universe. Eviscerating hate, body-eating hate, Hiranyakashipu hate, Kamsa hate, Kaurava hate, kingdom-scorching hate. In this jungle of our tangled lies and lives, in this wilderness of affection and attachments turned into recriminations and wounds, in this samsara, amid shards of words and actions flying like pieces of broken glass, we do not see love anymore. Still, it is from within this bitter brawl of family life that we Hindus yearn to find our gods, our Shiva Parvati, our Vishnu Lakshmi, and our beloved avatars, Krishna and Rama. Thank you.
So thanks Mr. Juluri for a wonderful description of his book. It's very difficult to sum up those things in just a matter of few minutes when he has spent years and years of his life researching, feeling, and as he was showing that picture, really contemplating what is this rearming? Whom should I dedicate? What exactly do we have to rearm with? So please give me a big round of applause for a wonderful book as well as a wonderful explanation of what we have. And the book is available just outside for sale, and inside the back, inside there itself, and you would have the privilege of getting it autographed from the author itself. And also, since it's a non-profit that we try to do all these things as volunteers, if at all anybody wants to do some small donation, there is a box over there for Jijnasa. With that, I want to now turn into question and answers, and Pardon me? Yeah. So I would invite Chaitra to come on over here. So here is, before the questions, here is what is the view of the book from a reader, and a very, very well qualified reader, my friend Mr. Chaitra.
Thank you. I am really excited to go through Professor Vamsee's book for a simple reason. That, see, I am a biologist by training, and I love to work with theories. And in the process, I decided one day to switch over to think about, reflect about my civilization. And it turns out that it's very difficult to think in those lines about our civilization, because there are hardly any theories that you can grapple with and talk about. But the unfortunate part is that the whole world, even starting from our common sense world to the way in which people talk about it in the university, are based upon certain set of theories. So there is a kind of blindness to most of us in understanding what is the nature of discourse that exists on Indian traditions. So in that sense, whenever you go and pick up, you try to build a conversation with some of the traditional practitioners or some people who claim to be authoritative people on, some of the traditions around, you feel really frustrated because they would never understand what is the question that is being posed in front of them. Not just that, there is a greater amount of ignorance that it is not necessary for us to think about anything that happens around us, but I, out of just sitting in some corner, will be able to have an authoritative account of what my tradition is. So this kind of an ignorance that exists. There is also another kind of ignorance that exists among many activists who work for Hindu cause, that it as if intellectual activities are irrelevant to their lived life. So they seem to be ignoring these facts. So in that center, amidst of this, you read many of the books, and most often these books would end up regurgitating the 300-year-old description of what has been told about Indian society by a set of Indologists, maybe by sociologists, maybe by political scientists. So it looks a very frustrating situation for you to sit and think about Hinduism in that way. So amidst that, there is a man who sits in media studies. You don't expect somebody from media studies to come and reflect about your tradition in the way, because by looking at the very nature of media studies, you would realize this is one area where there is a lot of shallow discourse exists, but suddenly there is one guy who comes and say, hey look, I'm going to formulate a problem. What is the problem? There is a description about a culture, and there seems to be an apparent problem about the description that are being provided about this culture. Now, we can sit and debate, have differences about the kind of solutions that he's thinking about. That doesn't interest me. We can continue to fight because we have a whole life to do that. But what is fascinating about is that there is one man who comes up and formulates it as an academic problem. But it is not just an academic problem, because we have a problem in social sciences that anything that gets written in social sciences is not meant to be read by and understood by common people. It is just impenetrable. It is not that the people who write understand it either. I mean, there is a supposed claim about it. So in that sense, he makes not just the formulation of a problem in the sense of an academic endeavor, but he also turns out in such a way that anybody can go and pick up, even though you might not get into the grip of what he is trying to argue or put forth, but you can connect with it. Because you have there are experiences in you. You're frustrated about media reports on rape, about the way in which, your devatas, your puja, your adhyatma, all these traditions are being talked about. So you are deeply frustrated about the way in which they're portrayed. So in that sense, you see echo of the kind of problem. There is a resonance of the kind of problem which are part of your day-to-day experience in this book. There are a whole bunch of examples. It's very simply, it's written. I mean, one of the more striking part of this book, I'm not interested in reading out the part of the book. That is very uninteresting. You can talk to him because the author is sitting right in front of you, and you can go and read, because this is not the book that, it cannot be read like a novel. You need to spend more time about it. You need to try to know the richness of what he was trying to do there. But what really is fascinating about it is that, so look, there is a way in which Hinduism being talked about. So there is this discourse of history. There is this discussion about myth. There is an argument of secularism. There is an argument about political institutions, social institutions. There is a lot of talk about caste system in India. There are a lot of stereo stories about superstitious practice that Hindus practice. So a whole bunch of issues that you see, and more or less the people of my generation around me are convinced that all these things are true. Now this is precisely the point where he makes an entry point and saying that, see, look, there is something fundamentally problematic about the way in which these problems have been tackled, not just necessarily in media, but about, in general, the academic world, which looks at India as another culture. Now, I don't want to declare and say that he has offered solutions that why there is such a problem exists. But the very nature in which he was trying to make an inquiry into these distinctions are pretty interesting. Because to begin that kind of an entry, you need to really break through certain ideas which our education has given us. Because, you know, from first standard, you know, you start learning social sciences. So you start learning about gender discrimination. You start learning about inequality in Indian society. You start learning about, you know, hierarchy in Indian society. You know the evils of caste system. You know, all these stories are so ingrained. You know, you are sort of there are no preachers, but social scientists are in some sense theologists. I'm going to come to that point simply quickly in a few minutes. But this, irrespective of whether you consciously or unconsciously teaching social sciences or doing social sciences, you're ending up doing theology. Now, to just to have a look at it in terms of long-run engagement with Professor Vamsee, I mean, I would just like to sketch upon some of the issues that haunt most of us in the long run, and then probably I would use that as an occasion to end my remarks on this. See, there were days where, see, India had gone through two colonialism. There was an Islamic colonialism